Good morning, welcome back to Aliyah Yami. Today we're going to be learning Emor Revi'i, the fourth Aliyah in Parshas Emor. The topic of our Aliyah is the festivals part 1. Our Aliyah runs from Perek Chof Gimel Pasuk Aleph all the way to Perek Chof Gimel Pasuk Chof Beis, 22 psukim in total. Let's take a look at the general overview of the Aliyah and then ponder on some fascinating points to gain perspective on. So here we go. Our Aliyah starts off describing the festivals. So it starts off with Eile Moadei Hashem. These are the Mikra Anahem Moadai. These are the festivals that you will tikra some Mikra Kodesh. You'll call them holy convocations. And then it goes on to say for 6 days your work will be done. Vayom Hashvi Shabbos Mikra Kodesh. There'll be a cessation on Shabbos. You shouldn't do any melacha. Okay, that's the first thing. Then we hear again about these are the festivals you should call. And the first one is the festival which is in the first month. That's what we call Nisan, on the 14th day. That's a day we call Pesach, in which we bring the Karban Pesach. Then in the evening, for 7 days, there's a festival called Chag HaMatzos. Today, colloquially, we call that Pesach, but technically speaking, the way the Torah refers to it, the 14th of the month when the Karban is brought, which is we call Erev Pesach, is Pesach. And then there's Chag HaMatzos, the festival of the unleavened bread, is starting that evening there afterwards. And we hear about the specific karbonos which are brought, and we hear that the first and 7th day of Mikra Kodesh are holy convocations. We then hear about the mitzvah that when we come to the land of Israel and we start harvesting the produce of the land, then a person will bring on the day after Pesach, on the day after the Shabbos, the day of cessation. That is when we're going to bring this Karban HaOmer, which is a grain sacrifice. There's the karbanos which are associated with it as well. And we're told that Velechem v'koli v'karmel lo sochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. We're not allowed to eat grain until that day, what we call chadash. We're not allowed to eat any grain which took seed for the last year until we bring the Karban HaOmer as well. Then we hear about what we call Sfira Sa'omer Usfarta Nochem Mocharas Shabbos. We're told that we're supposed to count from the day after the Shabbos, which refers to the day that we bring the Karban HaOmer, the day after the first day of Pesach. We're supposed to count 7 Shabbosos, Sheva Shabbosos Timimos Tiyana. We're going to count 7 full weeks, 50 days, and then we're going to bring a Mincha Chadasha, a new mincha, new meal offering to Hashem. This is what is called Shtei Esronim. We call the Shtei Halechem, and it is a first sacrifice to Hashem. As well, we hear about the accompanying sacrifices which go with it as part of Etzem Hayom Hazeh on this day, which we call Shavuos today, as a function of the weeks of the counting. And finally, we have the end of the Aliyah, that when we bring our Kutzrachem, when we bring our harvests in, we need to make sure to leave Pa'as Sadcha and the Leket Kitzircha, that we need to make sure to leave the corner, and anything which is left behind, drop down, goes to the poor people. So a lot of questions on our Aliyah. First of all, the way it describes how we interact with the festivals is Asher Tikru Oisam, you will call them. Why is that? Rashi explains, because Beis Din is required to actually announce, is required to make the distinction of when Rosh Chodesh is, which will affect when the days of the festivals are. So this comes down to us. This is a very significant element in the nation of Israel being in charge of the calendar, both the years and the months. As to whether there's an extra day or an extra month are in the hands of the nation of Israel, which is Asher Tikru Asam. Now, a very curious thing is the beginning, when we're about to talk about the festivals, then the Torah seems to have gone into tangent to talk about Shabbos. We know about Shabbos already. Why is Shabbos being described over here? So, the Rashi explains it's to tell us that the festivals are very serious. They're just like Shabbos. Just like Shabbos has a huge amount of gravity associated with it. You can't just take it whimsically. So to the festivals as well. However, Vilna Gaon says perhaps a different perspective. He says, you know what, if you count up all the days of the festivals in the year, think about this for a second. There's the first day of Pesach, the second day of Pesach, that's 2. There's 1 day of Shavuos, we're not talking about in Chutz La'aretz, we're talking about how the Torah prescribed it. Right, so 1 day of Pesach and 2 days of Pesach. The first and the last days are Yom Tov. Then 1 day of Shavuos, 1 day of Rosh Hashanah, skip Yom Kippur for a second, the first day of Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres. Right, so we have essentially 6 special days. Now, they are not like Shabbos in the sense that although most of the melachos are the same, there are a few which are allowed. The things which are allowed is oichel nefesh, anything which is for the needs of what one needs to eat. That would mean to say that cooking is allowed for the sake of Yom Tov. And that being the case, in a certain sense, there are 6 days in the year. Now, the 6 days referred to here are not the days of the week regarding Shabbos, in relationship to Shabbos, but rather the 6 days of the Yom Tovim Kol melacha ye'aseh bahem, that melacha can be done. What kind of melacha? The melacha of Te'aseh melacha, the melacha that's done is referring to the preparation for the Yom Tov, which can be done even on Yom Tov, the cooking on the Yom Tov as well. However, Yom HaShvi, Shabbos Hon, Mikra Kodesh, says the Vilna Gaon, refers to the seventh of all the festivals, which is Yom Kippur, and Kol Melacha Lo Yisasu, you cannot even do any melacha of Oichel Nefesh necessary for the preparation of that day. So in a certain sense, what's being described over here is not the 6 days of the week and the seventh day, which is Shabbos. It's referring to the 6 regular Yom Tovim from the Torah, and the seventh one, which is Yom Kippur, and this is a list of everything we're about to talk about. So this is the table of contents for the rest of the parak, which makes a whole lot of sense when it comes to the way that this parak is structured. It's not an interruption about Shabbos, it's actually talking about the Yom Tovim themselves. Now, how do the Korban HaOmer and the Shtei HaLechem work? These are 2 meal-based offerings, so these are what we call minachos, meal offerings. One is brought on the second day of Pesach, one is brought on the day of Shavuos. How do they work and what's their connection? So there's a few basics that are important to notice. Number one is that the Korban HaOmer is brought from barley, whereas the Shtei HaLechem is brought of wheat, different crops. The Korban HaOmer is made out of raw grain, whereas the Shtei HaLechem is processed grain in the form of bread. And finally, just thinking about the difference between barley and wheat. Barley is animal fodder usually, and wheat is usually human food. So it's worthwhile comparing this to the reversal Chet Adam HaRishon. If you think about this, the sin of Adam HaRishon, the Gemara tells us that, quoting the Gemara Ksubas tells us that before the Chet of Adam HaRishon, the trees were producing loaves of bread. When Hashem cursed the Adam in relationship to the earth, what he did was he slowed that process down, that human beings have to do a lot of manufacturing in order to be able to produce the necessary outcomes, the processed foods. That was what was happening then. In fact, there's the curse of the earth, in a certain sense, is a reversal or a slowing down of moving back to a stage where food needs to be worked on, where a person needs to work very hard in order to be able to produce fruit. It's interesting that the process of the Sfiras Omer is a movement away from that. It is a movement back to the stage of processed food, of food which is already developed, moving away from animalistic food into human-based food. There's one other difference as well, and that is the Achilas Omer, the Korban Omer, is what is matir achilas hediot, which means to say that regular people can eat chadash, which is all the grain in the last year, which could not be eaten up till this point. Whereas the Shtei HaLechem is the matir achilas gavoya. All the new grain, the chadash of the last grain since the last Shavuos, can only be eaten. It can only be brought on the mizbeach after the Shtei HaLechem. So it's a haloftia korban. There seems to be a movement upwards spiritually over here, which is reflecting the reversal of Chet Adam HaRishon in this process of Sfiras Omer itself. A lot to think about in this particular topic as well. Obviously, noting that Shavuos is a time of where the Midrash famously tells us Pasku Zuha Masam, that the Chet of the Adam HaRishon was lost or overcome at Har Sinai before the Chet HaEgel. There's a lot to think about in terms of that general pattern. Now, one of the most confusing psukim in Ar Aliyah, and really perhaps even in the entire Torah, is in Ar Aliyah, which is Usfartim Lachem Mocharas HaShabbos. You'll start counting after the Sabbath. It's a very, very confusing pasuk for the basic reason is that it's not after the Sabbath that we start counting, it's after the first day of Pesach. And in fact, there was a whole sect of Jews, the Baitusim, the Sadducees, the Tzedokim, who took this literally, and they said we will always count the Omer after Shabbos. It will always be on a Sunday to Sunday, so it will always be this 7 weeks starting on Sunday. Now, as convenient as it is, that's not what the Torah is understood to mean traditionally. But why would the Torah be so vague? Why would the Torah give us a misleading idea if, in fact, it wanted it to be the day after Pesach? Why is it so complicated? So the most basic, I think the most truthful understanding over here is that it's referring to an event that's going to occur in the future. Our Foreman points this out, that if you look in Yeshua Perek Hay, in the 11th and 12th Pasuk, it describes when the nation of Israel arrived in Israel, they crossed the Jordan on the 10th of Nisan, and then at that point in time they perform Bris Milah, they bring the Korban Pesach, and at that point in time the Pasuk tells us, Vayochlu me'avur ha'aretz, mimocharas ha'pesach, matzos v'kolei be'etzem ha'yom hazeh. When do they start eating of the produce of the land of Israel? They now just crossed the Jordan. From the day after Pesach, mimocharas ha'pesach, they start eating the grain of the land because that's when they're in the land of Israel. Then the Tanakh tells us, Vayishboi saman mimocharas, and the manna is now over. The manna now ceases. When they have started eating from the land. And they had nothing else left to eat, and that's why they started eating from the land of Canaan, which means they had supplies of the manna, of the man, for a month after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is when this is all occurring. When that ceased, that's when they started eating from the land itself, which means that perhaps when it says Mimacharas Hashabos, it doesn't refer to Sabbath as in the seventh day of the week. It could be referring to Hashabos, referring to the day of cessation. The day after the cessation of their supplies and their bags of the man is the day that they would start counting the Omer, and therefore the Torah is referring to the specific event, which happens to be that we know that that's Mimachras HaPesach, as the pasuk in Yeshua tells us, the day after Pesach, which is when the manna ceased. That's historically, it seems to be exactly what the Torah is telling us over here. However, on a more Kabbalistic side, the Rav Yaakov Leiner, the Beis Yaakov, explains that is quoted in the Beis Yaakov, who says that really, in a certain sense, all our counting of time, all of our Yomim Tovim stem from our Shabbos as well, which seems to be the way that the Aliyah is arranged as well, with the Shabbos being at the beginning of the whole process. Why? What does that mean? How exactly does that work? So he explains that Shabbos is kfir v'kaima. Shabbos is something which we have no control of. It's not dependent on any of the celestial orbits in the heavens. It is something which is decreed upon by Hashem and happens whether we like it or not. Every 7 days is Shabbos, in fact, and whether we like it or not, then there's everybody in the world agrees upon the same week. There's no one else who says that perhaps Saturday is on a different day. Everybody is on the same page when it comes to this. We have no control over that process. However, when it comes to the Moadim, the festivals, we do have flexibility, because when we decree the Rosh Chodesh is to be, is going to shift it, and ultimately can carry on shifting the Yomim Tovim. So we decide the lunar month is 29 and a half days roughly. We can decide that the Rosh Chodesh is on day 1 or day 2. That'll actually shift the calendar. That's why we say in the Davening, Mekadesh HaShabbos, Hashem sanctifies Shabbos, but in Mekadesh Yisrael V'azmanim, Hashem sanctifies Israel and the times, because those times are in our hands. That being the case, we have to understand that in order for us to have the power over the calendar, in order for us to be granted that responsibility, we need to also realize that time really emanates from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we can count and we can declare, but that all comes from Shabbos, that comes from the part that is out of our control. Letting go is the place where we have the most control in our lives as well. Very important idea. Rav Zevin also points out an interesting point, and he says that there's a well-known phrase which sometimes is attributed to certain people in Judaism, but it's a complicated idea. Ha'avar ayin, the past is not ha'asid adayin, the future is still to be. Ha'aver kerev ayin, the present is just like a fleeting moment. Imkein da'aga minayim. So therefore, where does worry come from? In fact, the Jewish way of looking at things is the opposite, which is imkein yesh lidoig, you have to really worry. But the truth is that Rav Zevin points out in understanding this, the pasuk of counting the Omer, is that all we really have in our lives is our present. We only have the now. And the Seras Omer is a reminder of experiencing that now, utilizing that now in the best of ways properly. He quotes the pasuk of Avram Zaken Baba Yamim Vashem Berechas Avram Bakol, that Avram Avinu was old and he came in days. That means to say that his days were able to come in front of him and say, you validated us, you used all of us. It wasn't a day that you killed, wasted, or ignored. That's what the Seras Omer is counting the days in our lives. Emily Dickinson famously says, forever is composed of nows, and that's the point, is trying to appreciate the nows in our life. Finally, one last point, and that is that there's Peah and Leket, which is these gifts to the poor, which are mentioned at the end of the Aliyah. Why is it over here? So Rav Soroskin presents two options looking backwards. It's the framing the Aliyah. At the beginning of the Aliyah talks about the grain harvest, which brings the Korban Omer and the Shtei Alechem, and now it talks about the grain which goes to the poor. So he says that if a person ignores the ritual, ignores giving to Hashem, ultimately they're going to ignore giving to the poor as well. Another possibility is, if you look forward, the next Aliyah is about to talk about the Yimei Adin, Yom Rosh and Yom Kippur. In order for you to succeed in Yom Adin, you find somebody who is vulnerable and give to them. That's the best way of succeeding in the Yom Adin. That's another perspective looking forward. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.